Okay. Oh yeah, sounds good. I can hear it. Okay.
So the center is open on Sunday.
Yes.
Regular time.
Regular time. Yeah.
But anything for Christmas Eve or Christmas Day?
No. Just Sunday. Then Tuesday, Thursday, nothing. And then the next Sunday again. Christmas. Let's see. Yeah, Sunday's Christmas Eve. So Christmas Eve, yes, in the morning. The regular Sunday. Then New Year's Eve. Yeah. I don't know if it's in the morning, but it's in the evening. Maybe both. Yeah, maybe both. It's definitely in the evening. And then New Year's Day, 8:00 in the morning, but very short.
8:00 in the morning.
Day, yeah.
New Year's Day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very short.
Prayers at 7 at night on New Year's Eve?
New Year's Eve, yeah, right. It's the regular time, 7:00. Our regular evening time, 7:00, and we do 2 hours of Vajrasattva purification.
Okay.
Yep.
The book was quite different. In the chapter, not of history, it was about meditation. It's a chapter that I missed last week when I was out.
Yeah, more like history.
And history, more like meditation.
Well, yeah. It's talking about the 4 immeasurables, the 4 states of Brahma, and the mindsets around that. Yeah, absolutely. History in the sense that Buddha took those teachings from Hindu or existing teachings at that time, but he transformed everything. So most of his teachings were brand new, but even the older teachings, he took them, but he transformed them. He changed their meaning, giving them more profound meaning. Remarkable story. So for those people who are just joining us now, again, we're going through Michael Carrithers' book, Buddha, A Short Introduction. Michael Carrithers, I think, is an academic, and this book is from 1983. And I very much like it because it talks about, definitely talking to a Western audience. There are Tibetans who don't really know the details much of the Buddha's story. They don't focus on that. They're focusing on the teachings and practices that have come out of it and their own accumulation of merit, their own purification, or their own practice. But for us, I think it's very helpful, for Americans, Westerners, to know the Buddha story. There's so much teaching in there. And also, as this academic does, presenting his story in a way, that Westerners can relate to, people that we talk to who aren't Buddhists, because we don't live in a Buddhist environment, a Buddhist culture. So there aren't these shared understandings. Again, an ordinary Tibetan may not know, say nothing about very, very little, but they have confidence in the Dharma because of the benefit that's happened in their culture because of it. Like we have confidence in science. I don't know anything really about science, especially the higher levels of it, but I do have confidence that there's something worthwhile there, something valid in its own realm. So too for this. So we ended last time on page 39. We're in is chapter 3, which is called To the Awakening. So we're talking about the Buddha's story, his history, and they didn't mention much here about the actual details around his leaving the palace, leaving his wife and newborn child. But they did have some discussion here of the meditations that he was doing when he entered onto the spiritual path. So again, he was this prince. It's possible that, in the story we've glorified the kind of power or reputation of his particular kingdom. He's called a prince. They call it a kingdom. They had a king, but it's believed that the Shakyas were really sort of more like maybe modern day England, where they had a king, but there was almost a republic, a board of trustees, anyway, nobles who had a lot to say about how the place was run. But nonetheless, mythologically, he's a prince. This emphasis of leaving this life of luxury and ease in order to discover the cause of suffering. And so his first endeavors were seeking out esteemed teachers of his time, and practicing with them, and importantly, coming to their deepest realizations. At which point each of these teachers, said, gee, why don't you can be in my, I can transmit my teachings to you. I already have, but you can be the successor and take my students and keep our lineage going. But the Buddha said no, because it wasn't a complete understanding. So these practices that he was doing, the states that he attained to, are what we call in our prayer book the four immeasurables. So again, the Buddha took teachings that were existing later when he came to his great enlightenment and started teaching. He took teachings, adopted teachings that were in existence, but transformed them. And the four immeasurables, what we just read, is an excellent example of that. Because these four immeasurables, again, we hear in the text, you often hear, the three realms. They're always talking about the six realms, right? But the six realms are the six realms within the realm of desire. So in the bigger classification, there are three realms. The realm of desire, where everything is motivated by desire. And that's where we find ourselves as human beings. Animals are there. The lower gods are there. The fighting gods are there. The hungry ghosts and the hellish beings are all in the realm of desire, because we desire things and we never completely get satisfaction with those desires. Because if you think about it, this is the paradoxical state we are in, that even if you're desiring to be without desire, you get there by desiring that. So we're in this realm of desire. Now, above us, in the sense of being more subtle, is the realm of form, and this means subtle form. So there, we're talking about higher God realms, where everything is very refined, and the suffering is very much hidden, only manifests at the time of transition, when you die after a long lifespan, like an eon, tens of thousands of years or more. And then above that is arupa, without form, the formless realm. And this is what the Buddha attained to, the two highest states of the formless realm. And so how that's described is that the attainment of the first, they're called the viharas, like the temples, the homes, the status of Brahma, the highest god in the ancient Indian religious traditions. And so this first stage is of infinite space. You're aware of nothing but just the infinity of space, that kind of vastness. The next level up in the formless realm is the realization of the infinity of consciousness. So this is a step more subtle, and you can rest in that kind of place for, again, they say a long time. Then the next one up is, let's see, I can't remember. Anyone remember what it is? There's space, there's consciousness, there's, they call it emptiness, but it's not the shunyata, it's not the realization emptiness. It's just that there's nothing in a material sense, but you are still, you still have this ego in a sense, but you are aware of the nothingness in opposition to you. Then finally, the highest of the formless states is neither perception nor non-perception. So very, very subtle understanding. Now, remarkably, what the Buddha did is that he associated these very highly advanced states two qualities of bodhicitta. In other words, this first realm of the infinity of space is love. This desire, well, this mindset, this motivation really of wanting all beings to be happy. That's what he said was the space-like mind. Then going up, infinite consciousness, all you're aware of is the consciousness, he equated that to compassion. So it's more subtle than love, but it wants all beings to be removed from suffering. That's the mindset. Then the next one up, the samsaric emptiness, you might call it, that corresponds with spontaneous joy. In other words, he described it as, if you see someone doing a virtuous thing that you share in your mind is completely at one with the virtue that's being done. And Garam Pache has said this is the easiest way to come to enlightenment. It's just simply feeling spontaneous joy, sympathetic joy with whatever virtuous things you see. Rather remarkable, but it's vast. And then finally, the highest samsaric state, the state of neither perception nor non-perception, the Buddha equated with equanimity. So when we practice the four immeasurables, though, there's a practical step that's a little bit different. We start with equanimity. In other words, we're like pointing to the highest samsaric state because this great impartiality is necessary for this very profound practice. As Garam Pache wrote or was recorded as saying in his teachings introductory to his Vajrakalaya practice, he was saying that, the measure of bodhicitta is that one is compassionate towards the person who's killing you. That's really a remarkable statement if you think about it, but that's the great equanimity. You have this impartiality. You're not judging people in that way, in an ultimate way. It doesn't mean that if someone's trying to kill you, you don't run away or you don't even defend yourself. But it's this idea that, like Lama Tarchin said, you have a rabid wolf terrorizing the flocks and running through the village is very dangerous. Maybe the wolf has to be killed, but you're not killing it with this mindset, the goddamn wolf. Instead, I'm so sorry I have to do this, but at least we're shortening the negative karma that you're doing too. So again, Buddha took these worldly meditations and then transformed them, but they weren't satisfactory to him. So he went on, and we'll get more into the story, but that's what we basically talked about last week. And now we're at page 39. Starts with knowledge of the self. At issue was the peculiarly yogic conception of knowledge. For the knowledge of the self, now again, this is in ancient Indian teachings, the emphasis was on the Atman, the self. And so, for instance, in our own age, the title that they gave Mahatma Gandhi was Mahatma. Atman, Maha, the great soul, the great self, Maha, Atman, Mahatma. All right. So at issue was the peculiarly yogic conception of knowledge. For the knowledge of the self, the Atman, promulgated in such systems, the existing systems then, was radically different from other sorts of knowledge. From the yogic point of view, the knower, the self, is identical with the known, the self. And these in turn are identical with the knower's frame of mind. So this is rather radical and rather amazing. And to this day, it's sort of what's called Hinduism, many, many different traditions. It was the British that put the name Hinduism on all these different traditions. The Indians themselves, I don't even know if these days they've adopted, that term Hinduism, but I don't know really if they did categorize, or these were all just different paths to realization. But nonetheless, Buddhists and the Hindus share this belief that the experiences, the knowledge actually, that comes from looking within, from proper meditation and practice, the knowledge that comes from that is valid. Whereas in the West, we do have a mystic tradition where it's sort of somewhat akin, but at the same time, generally, our modern scientific way, our nihilistic kind of materialistic side, treats all these inner experiences as just sort of, I don't know, some chemical combination or just some sort of hallucination or something. But of course, they don't look at it, and they only look at it through a scientific lens. So they're not validating, they don't acknowledge the validity of these methods and the knowledge that comes from this kind of practice. So anyway, to get the measure of this, again, saying from the yogic point of view, the knower, the self, is identical with the known self. And these in turn are identical with the knower's frame of mind. To get the measure of this, let us begin with a contrasting example of ordinary knowledge, that of a skilled goldsmith. Such examples were frequently used by the Buddha himself, since they already have stamped on them his peculiarly pragmatic turn of mind. In this case, there can be no doubt that the knower, the goldsmith, is inherently different from what he knows. As a craftsman and as a knowing subject, he is clearly to be distinguished from his knowledge of the gold, from his knowledge of its properties and uses, and of the skills by which gold may be manipulated. Though we might admit that he would not be much of a goldsmith without the knowledge, we would never, in the ordinary course of things, be tempted to say that he was identical with his knowledge. The man is one thing, the knowledge is another. Nor would we be tempted to say that a goldsmith's frame of mind was identical with the goldsmith himself. A goldsmith might be angry and upset, or tranquil and alert, and he would still be a goldsmith. Nor again would we confuse his frame of mind with his knowledge. Whether angry or tranquil, he would still have the knowledge of goldsmithing. In the case of the goldsmith, the knower, the known, and the frame of mind are clearly separate things, even if associated in one goldsmith. But the introspective yogic knowledge of the self is quite another matter. For in the first place, in this yogic knowledge, the knower is the same as the known. The self, with a capital S, is that which is to be known, and is the same as the knowing self with a small s. Indeed, the Upanishadic texts which proclaim this do not differentiate between the two senses of self, the big self and the little self. To know oneself in this yogic sense is also to attain or become one's self. The power of the Upanishadic vision lies precisely here, in that the witness, the subject of knowledge, reaches a condition in which it witnesses only itself. It is a vision of radical simplification, of the perfect self-identity of the self. There is in it, the self, no diversity. And that's a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, I think. To realize this self, the yogi has only to turn inward upon himself. This radical simplification has other consequences as well. Since there is no duality of perceived and perceiver, there are also no perceivable or analyzable qualities in the self. And again, that's a quotation from, I think, Bhagavad Gita. Let me see if I can tell this B4. What text? adjusted. Yeah, I can't find it. Well, maybe for next time. Okay. Nonetheless, again, the radical simplification has other consequences as well. Since there is no duality of perceived and perceiver, there are also no perceivable or analyzable qualities in the self. If, for example, what is to be realized in meditation is the self as bliss, one Upanishadic formulation, then the self is, from the point of view of the meditator, identical with bliss. Bliss cannot be separated out, distinguished from the self. Or again, if the self is to be realized, is the self without qualities, then there is no frame of mind without qualities, separate from the self. But for in the self, there is no diversity. One can see the plausibility of this from the yogi's point of view, for in accomplished states of meditation, he may feel precisely this sense of becoming an object of meditation, of total simplification of his experience. So again, this is a discussion basically of kind of Hindu understanding of some of these meditative states. Now, Carrithers continues, moreover, such an experience of radical simplification also implies the immutability of the self, because the self is changeless. For since the self is so perfectly unified, it cannot be thought of as changing, as losing old qualities and taking on new ones. Indeed, the self without qualities could never, by its very definition, be shown to change. And to say immutable is to say eternal. The Buddha's answer to this was that precisely because such meditative states stop sometimes, they cannot be eternal. But for a meditator bolstered by the conviction that what he sought was eternal, the very experience of stability and simplification in meditation would confirm the conviction of eternity. It would confirm as well the conviction that this eternal, immutable, radically simple self was beyond the world of cause and effect, uncreated, unborn, so it could not be analyzed, broken down in constituent parts. It would, for him, be the all-embracing and undifferentiated ground of the universe, Brahman. So this is, a description of kind of like the higher kind of, you might say, theological teachings of Hinduism, this idea of an absolute kind of oneness. Now, I don't know if he's going to get into it. We'll find out as we read here. But one way of thinking of the difference between Hinduism and Buddhism is that Hinduism is teaching this, and I could be wrong on this because I don't have any experience in Hinduism at all, just from a little bit of reading, and especially from some of the Buddhist perspectives of people who think about these kinds of things in an attempt to elucidate. But basically, this idea of absolute oneness, you might think of as a Hindu idea. I can't remember what the phrase in Sanskrit is, but it's just, it's what it's saying here. The self, the knower, is the same as the self, the object, this oneness. But the Buddhist view is a view of not two-ness, which is, I think, subtler. Because the fact that it's not two, we still share this nature, you might say, but in a sense that's completely individuated at the same time. So this is the source of the Mahayana and the Buddha's great compassion, is that these seemingly individual and isolated entities that we see, they're not to be discarded. So I'm sure he'll do more on this later, but at any rate, this is the basic understanding. And that's what the Buddha rejected. He didn't reject it, but he just went past it. So he was experiencing this neither perception nor non-perception. He was experiencing the emptiness, the secular kind of emptiness, like the oneness with Brahman. And this was the peak of the Hindu system, what's loosely called Hindu system. But for the Buddha, he accomplished that, but it wasn't enough for him. The self, the Atman in short, is an eternal, seamless whole, self-identical, beyond phenomenal appearances and unanalyzable, yet to be achieved and known through yogic meditation. This yogic vision was a powerful and persuasive one, perhaps precisely because it cut through all the diversity and potential confusion of ordinary experience and offered at a stroke a decisively simple view of the ultimate reality. Any one feature of the vision, the experience of deep meditation, the question of what lies beyond the painful world of appearances, or the nature of self-knowledge, leads inexorably towards each of its other features. It is no wonder that, despite the Buddha's best efforts, its career continued and expanded in Hindu India. Yeah. This yogic vision was powerful and persuasive one, perhaps precisely because it cut through all the diversity and potential confusion of ordinary experience and offered at a stroke a decisively simple view of the ultimate reality. You know, you can see sort of the scientific akin, or sort of, you know, it's like it's very scientific in its approach, in the sense that we're confronted by this world of appearances. It's, you know, it just can seem chaotic. It can seem overwhelming. But, you know, with science, you're finding like the sense underneath that. I mean, it's really amazing. Like the law in thermodynamics, everything is like running downhill. You know, it's like a common factor in the midst of this overwhelming display of appearances. So similarly here, but we're doing it in an inner way. And this is very powerful because it never died out in India. Although one like myself would believe that the Buddha sort of took it to its ultimate state and then sort of went beyond it. But on the other hand, once one bit of it begins to unravel, the rest follows swiftly. We can reconstruct how the Buddha's pragmatic reasoning about meditation led him to reject the self theories through a discourse in which the Buddha replies to the question of an ascetic, Patapada. Yeah, that's the name of the ascetic questioning him. If, to pick up the thread at the experience of deep meditation, the meditator is able to witness the self directly and thereby attain knowledge of it, it could be asked, and was asked by Patapada, whether the frame of mind in deep meditation arises first and only afterwards the knowledge of the self appropriate to that frame of mind, or whether the knowledge of the self comes first and then the frame of mind, or whether they are simultaneous. All right, so this is a little wordy here. But in other words, when you're talking about the knowledge of the self, and in these yogic practices, they believe you could come to experience, gain the knowledge of the self. But what is that? And is that knowledge of the self, like an object, is that come after, in cause and effect, after we attain this particular state of mind, this particular samadhi, this particular trance, you might say, in the positive meaning of trance? So you attain to this mind state and then you realize the nature of self, or are you realizing the nature of self, and then the sort of the product of that is the mindset, that particular mindset, or are they simultaneous? So that was the question. That is, Could the ascetic Patapada, that's his name, Patada, I can't say it well, Patpada, expect to reach some meditative state and then cast about for the self? Or would the attainment of the state automatically entail the attainment of the self? So that was the question that was posed to the Buddha by this wandering ascetic. To this, the Buddha quite plausibly answered that a particular consciousness or frame of mind arises first, and then the knowledge which accompanies that consciousness. This is the Buddha's meditative pragmatism speaking. For the skilled meditator, having trained to achieve that consciousness, quote, knows that it is from such and such conditions that such a consciousness has arisen in me, unquote. The meditator's practical skill in manipulating the causes and conditions in himself which give rise to progressively more refined states of consciousness. It is upon that achievement and upon the practical knowledge of introspective psychology that goes with it that his eventual knowledge of the self rests. One can see how even the yogic teachers might have given away this much. For after all, there is a good deal of training and skill and of practical advice to go with it. In any meditative system, there is a good deal of training and skill and of practical advice. But once this is admitted, the whole yogic system begins to crumble. For from this radically practical point of view, the meditative state, caused and conditioned by the yogi's training, cannot be equivalent to an uncaused, unborn, unanalyzable self. The state itself is quite analyzable and clearly caused by something. In the discourse, where this interaction that happened between the Buddha and this ascetic, the Buddha continues to spin out the implications of this pragmatism. Patapada asks another question, quote, is the consciousness or frame of mind the same as the self, or are the self and the consciousness different? Unquote. To this, the Buddha posed the counter question, quote, but what is the self you profess to believe in? Unquote. The sense of this question lies in the fact that, though the basic form of self theories was the same from the Buddha's point of view, there were evidently many variants in the theory. Different theories might place their vision of the self in rather different spiritual landscapes, or one theory might contain a teaching of several increasingly refined selves leading up to the ultimate one. So Patapada first offered this, quote, I profess a material self having a specific form, made of the four elements and nourished by solid food, unquote. The Buddha then replied that, quote, if there were such a material self, then the frame of mind and the self would be different. For even granting such a self, still some frames of mind would come into being, and others would pass away, unquote. When Patapada then changed tack and proposed first a self not made of material, but of mind stuff, and then one of consciousness alone, the Buddha reiterated his argument. The self so constituted must be one thing, the frame of mind or state of consciousness quite another. And the reason for this is quite clear. By a yogic definition, the self, whether it is material, immaterial, or made of consciousness, must be eternal, unchanging, and independent of the causes and conditions of this world. But it is a fact of meditative experience that states of consciousness come and go, for reasons that the meditator himself can understand and to some limited extent control. So whatever might be eternal, it is not the states of consciousness, and they must therefore be different from the eternal self. This is rather heady, of course, but important to understand because, why didn't the Buddha accept the teachings of his time. The Buddha was aided in this judgment by the use of a word which he took into his vocabulary and made his own. The root meaning of the word, samkhata, is something like prepared or composed. It covers a rather wider field than prepared. So, however, and in fact, it has two meanings, which are relevant here. It means willed or intended, and it also means caused or conditioned. Meditative states are samkhata. They are attained by the will or intention of the meditator, and this also means that they are caused and conditioned. They are attributable to certain preceding causes and dependent on certain contemporaneous conditions being fulfilled. As such, they are not at all unborn, nor are they independent of circumstance. One might speculate that this is as far as he took his investigation of meditation and the self at the time of his encounter with his yogic teachers. But in his mature teaching, the Buddha unravels their theory of the self a great deal further. So far, in fact, that he was to reject it entirely and propose in its place the characteristic Buddhist doctrine of non-self, anatta, the absence of an eternal, independent self, whether in ordinary consciousness, in meditative states, or anywhere else. This teaching was well integrated with his other thought on both ethics and psychology. In his mature view, this eternal self could not be witnessed at all, and those who believe in it are likened to a man who says that he is in love with the most beautiful woman in the land, but is unable to specify her name, her family, or her appearance. Wow. The eternal self, the Atman, is, in other words, a product of speculation, of falsely understood meditative experience, or of hearsay. The Buddha was willing to admit the existence of a self, and here the lowercase s is very appropriate, but that self was merely, quote, an agreed term, a common form of words, a worldly usage, a practical designation. One could reasonably say, discipline yourself or know yourself, but in saying, one would not be assuming the existence of an eternal entity. The Buddha drew an analogy with milk. Milk can become curds, then butter, and then ghee, but there would be no point of speaking of an abiding entity like milkness, which would persist through these changes. Milk is just milk, butter just butter. The British scholar T.W. Rhys Davids put it in these terms. So this is the British scholar, one of the first, scholars of Buddhism. I think did extensive work with the Pali sutras. When the change in the composition of the personality has reached a certain point, it is convenient to change the designation, the name by which the personality is known, just as in the products of the cow. But the abstract term is only a convenient form of expression. There never was any personality as a separate entity all the time. So yeah, this is the most radical thing of the Buddha's teachings, is this teaching of no self in the ultimate sense, like a no soul, those kinds of things. And people often find this very kind of frightening because we're, no matter whether we're materialists or not in our modern society, our culture is very much a theistic one, which believes in sort of solid reality, so to speak. And the self or the soul becomes the most important factor. But of course, no one's ever found it. So when we say, I feel as if I am a different person today, we are in fact alluding to an important truth about human nature. This is a difficult doctrine and a courageous one, in that it led into waters uncharted by the meditators of the Buddha's time. One difficulty is that of purely intellectual understanding. When the Buddha went on to develop a new method of meditation, it was aimed at analyzing in detail the self, small s, of the meditator. By this method, one could see how this self was in fact composed, made up from previous causes, and subsisting on contemporaneous conditions. The doctrine in detail is one of formidable complexity, but its basic principle is simple. Just as milk progressively changes, so the self, which we experience, changes continually for specifiable reasons. Now, also, just as an aside here, this is, you see, the teachings of rebirth. It's very subtle. This self that doesn't exist is this progression of changing causes and conditions. And this process is not stopped by death. That's where you can start to get maybe a confidence in the teachings of rebirth, because it's not based on some sort of, primitive belief, but really as sophisticated as you can get in a meditative sense. All right. The real difficulty is not, however, one of intellectual understanding, but of emotional plausibility. Anyone might ask with alarm, how can I, with my well-developed sense of myself, be expected to accept that I have no self? The intellectual answer is that one has a self, but no eternal self, capital S. But it is the emotional answer which is important. Since anyone attempting to attain or witness an eternal, unchanging self was, in the Buddha's view, bound to failure, the doctrine of the self was an invitation to further suffering. Oh, wow. Such a doctrine of the eternal self is merely a sensation, this is the Buddha speaking, a writhing in discomfort of those venerable ascetics and Brahmins who neither know nor see, and who have fallen victim to desire for such a self. So to give up, and that's the end of the quote, so to give up such a doctrine was to give up a potent source of frustration. The emotional tone of the teaching of non-self was that of a calm and relieved detachment. It was a liberation which transcended the frustrated strivings of those who revolve around a self, quote, like a dog tied to a post. Now again, here, you see the profundity of Buddha's teachings, because you see the profundity of that first noble truth, that is the fact of suffering, and that his whole teaching was to destroy suffering. Because even in this idea, and this is where you get an idea too, I mean, years, centuries later, Nagarjuna, speaking of wrong view. Again, Buddhism is the middle path, the middle view between the extremes of eternalism and the extreme of nihilism. So if your object is to get rid of suffering, nihilism's not going to do it. It just doesn't. It doesn't provide an answer. And one lifetime, everything's just sort of meaningless, and you just fall into a non-existence, so to speak. That's what it teaches. Well, that's got to be kind of upsetting to everybody, even people who accept it. It's still not full in an intellectual understanding kind of way. So there's dissatisfaction there, the truth of suffering. But the danger of the nihilistic view is that based on that, there's no real basis for virtue, which is, again, because of cause and effect, the cause of happiness is the seed of it is virtue, all the different virtues by body, speech, and mind. So there's no basis. I mean, you might be doing that inadvertently, have an atheistic view, that's okay. Maybe some sort of inner sense that you have, but nonetheless, in that view itself, there's no firm, valid, really solid, you might say, cause for happiness. Whereas in the eternalist side, the people that believe in an external God, there is a basis for virtue, because they believe in something more than this human realm, and therefore the whatever, 10 commandments and all those kinds of things. They're doing that with a sense of self or soul, so it's not liberating completely, but it does create positive karma. So it's a very subtle thing, this idea of the Buddha's radical teaching. I mean, his first thing out of the box is explaining suffering to the world. How do we get rid of that? It works in this immediate way as a deluded human being, but it also works in the higher meditative states too. It's just truly remarkable. Okay. Yeah. It was a liberation which transcended the frustrated strivings of those who revolve around a self, quote, like a dog tied to a post. But let us return now to his next section. Now we're entering in release from bondage through self-mortification, because that was his next career. But let us return for the moment to that point at which the Buddha realized that these yogic systems of meditation in their very nature led to mutable states of consciousness quite different from their avowed object, the eternal self. From such a conclusion, two further consequences might follow. One is that there is indeed no eternal self, and that is the path the Buddha eventually took. The other is that the self exists, but is not to be obtained by yogic methods. Another discipline, however, might lead to its achievement, and there was such a discipline at hand, the method of self-mortification and extreme asceticism, which we know best through Jainism. On such a view, the Jains still exist today. It's a tradition within India. The founder of what's called Jainism was Mahavira, who was a contemporary of the Buddha. He was older. We don't know if they ever met each other. On such a view, the eternal principle in the individual, called the jiva, the life or soul, is held in the world of suffering by the effects of transgressions committed in earlier lives, and these effects adhere to the soul like dirt. By avoiding further transgressions, one obviates further bondage in the world of suffering, and by self-mortification and voluntary penitence, one burns away the effects of former transgressions from the soul, so that it rises to bliss and eternal freedom from pain. Here there is no necessity for meditation, nor for the application of introspective knowledge, though the theory probably did hold, as Jainism does, that knowledge, indeed omniscience, would miraculously result from the successful prosecution of such asceticism. So after leaving Uddaka Ramaputra, the yogic teacher, the Buddha turned to self-mortification, and the canonical discourses leave no doubt about the sincerity of his efforts in this direction. He stopped breathing completely, so that, quote, violent winds racked my head, and violent winds carved up my belly, as a skilled butcher carves up an ox's belly with a sharp knife, unquote. Passing deities thought he was dead. Then he gave up eating more than a handful of food daily, so that, quote, my spine stood out like a corded rope, my ribs projected like the jutting rafters of an old roofless cowshed, and the light of my eyes, sunk down in their sockets, looked like the gleam of water sunk in a deep well. And then you see opposite page 46, this photo of a statue, a figure of the Buddha in his ascetic phase, which are, very graphic. Passers-bys thought him a black man. So much had his austerities affected his clear complexion. By the extremity of these exertions, the Buddha came to the conclusion that, quote, in the past, present, or future, whatever ascetic or Brahmin might experience such a painful, racking, and piercing feelings, he will not exceed this. He claimed to have out-asceticized any ascetic practices. But he also came to the conclusion that, quote, by these grueling exertions, I have by no means gone beyond the common human condition to an eminence of knowledge and vision appropriate to those who are truly spiritually noble. Or in other words, all he had to show for it was a prominent rib cage. Quote, there must be another path to wisdom, unquote. Okay, so that's page 48. We'll stop there for this week. We won't have study group for 2 weeks now. Next Thursday is off, but 2 weeks from tonight, we'll start on page 48 with the middle path. Okay, yeah, a lot of me just reading, a lot of heady stuff to just be listening to and pondering. There's a lot of rich stuff there to be thinking over in a very deep kind of way. Any questions before we conclude tonight? Okay, I wanted to thank everyone for wading through this difficult stuff. This is not simple stuff, but I think it's so important because a great Lama comes to town and people can be just spontaneously enthused and even committed, moved. Something very positive is happening in their mind. But understanding these teachings like this right from the get-go of the Buddhist tradition, very helpful in communicating to others, and also for your own understanding, to understand how profound it is. Again, the first noble truth, rebirth, these are really profound teachings, and they sound to many people, they sound like kind of primitive or something, or just made up. But you see sort of the struggle that the Buddha did and the depths that he was doing. I mean, look at the level of his commitment, leaving his situation, unbelievable, as a prince, and then accomplishing these great meditative states, but then rejecting them for this incredibly profound reason that no one else saw. And now trying the ascetic path, thinking that maybe because there's only two ways out of this, either is no self or there is one, but maybe you can get to it by sort of killing. He said somewhere he was attempting to kill the ego, basically, thinking that wisdom would arise. Said with more subtlety and elaboration here tonight. Okay. All right, so in that case, we dedicate the merit from this evening to all motherly sentient beings. May we increase our knowledge and wisdom, and that knowledge and wisdom be revealed as the true compassion, the mindset that removes all beings from suffering. Svaha. Okay. And he's got the book too, right? So you can transcribe and then you can read and study. Yeah, you'll get it right. Really good. Yeah, right. Well, Keen was here too.